Okay, good morning. We are learning the Nishmas Mendel, Mariam Bas Kalman Ruvain. We are up to the last Amud of the first parak of Masech Shabbos. I think the hardest parak in my humble opinion. So you make it this far, we're good to go. We're good to go. Only like 100, plus blot to go in Masechta. So the Gemara told us that you are not allowed to roast items unless you can't put on food onto the fire before Shabbos unless it is roasted or unless it's cooked. The question is, until what degree does it have to be cooked? That you don't have to worry about it. So ask the Gemara. We're on just at the beginning of the Gemara, second line, and Chaf Amud Aleph. The Kama. How much of the food has to be roasted before Shabbos comes so that it's not a problem? Amar Rav Lazar, Amar Rav, Kedesh Yitzol Mos Yom Kema'achal Ben Drusai. The food has to be roasted or cooked the amount of the food of Ben Drusai. Who's Ben Drusai? Ben Drusai famously is a villain. He is a bandit, someone who is on the run always. He was an actual figure in the times of the Gemara who was a thief, and he'd basically always be on the run. And so a person on the run, they don't have time to prepare their food properly, right? So what would they do? They would cook their food just a third of the way. Because machlokas is a half or a third. We'll go with Rashi's approach. It's a third of the way, and once a third of the way it's edible, they'll eat it. So it's like fascinating. There's like a major halacha in Shas and throughout the poskim, and we always invoke this like robber. And basically, whenever we want to quote how much the food has to be cooked, we say Michael Ben Drusai, the amount of food of Ben Drusai. It's like it's a beautiful thing that Chazal speak about. The notion of like being able to like learn things from everyone. Here's a guy. Again, keep in mind when we talk about thieves back in the day, we're not talking about someone who just like stole. We're talking about a murderer. This guy's a murderer, right? And a famous, infamous murderer. And we learn from him how much. So we use him to teach us how much you have to cook. But just like that notion of being able to say, like, I'm going to be learned from every single one of my interactions is not a small thing. Pretty impressive. But this is the halacha. The halacha is, and this comes up all the time. Once food is a third of the way cooked, all the blechs, we still haven't gotten into blechs and covering things and all that, which we're going to discuss soon. But in the meantime, we saw already that there's this general concern you might adjust temperature. So similarly nowadays, let's just plug it into a practical thing. Forget crock pots because they're a little bit, they have their own stuff. But basically, let's say you have chicken. So, it's a short Shabbos and you didn't cook your chicken fully, and you come home right before Shabbos. So what we're being taught over here is you could theoretically put it in the oven as long as you have enough time for it to be cooked through a third of the amount. So what's a third of the amount? Let's say it takes, an hour and a half to cook your chicken, let's just say. So a half hour, as long as it was enough that it could be cooked for a half hour, you could put your chicken into the oven without covering the knobs or whatever it is. It's hard to really create a blech in your oven. And as long as it was there for a half hour, you're totally fine. If you didn't have enough time, and it's less than that, you would not be able to do that because there's a concern. You might want to adjust the temperature in order to ensure that your food is cooked. Okay, but this comes up sometimes. Person's rushing. As long as you have a third of the amount of time, then you could put it in the oven, and it's not a problem. Yeah.
Chicken's okay. It's not just meat. Chicken, you cook a third of the way through.
Yeah. And a meat you wouldn't.
Meat, you can have meat a little bit more rare than chicken.
Yeah, the post can understand there's a general rule for all foods. It's not limited to meat. Any food, chicken, meat, basically any food, as long as it's a third of the way cooked, then we're not concerned anymore that you're going to adjust. Now again, as long as it's a third of the way cooked, it'd be true for chicken as well.
You can continue cooking it past that point.
Right. The point is that it has to be a third of the way cooked before Shabbos. Right. And Max is pointing out, right. He's saying it's based on a premise of Michael Ben Drusai, that Drusai was eating this. Okay, he may not have been the healthiest guy in the world. Bottom line is, as long as we're a third of the way through, then we're good to go. Okay, and that's halacha l'maisa that this comes up. Again, this comes up, and the person's, for whatever reason, rushing. As long as you can make it a third of the way through, it's fine.
It's interesting that we know how much he would cook his food.
Yeah. How do we know? Okay, fair enough. Okay. It's Marnami was taught as well in a brisa. Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rav Yochanan, not in a brisa. Sorry, it was taught as well. Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rav Yochanan, Kol Shehum K'Michael Ben Drusai, Ein Bo Mishum B'Shulei Nachrim. A similar type of principle, and that is that if you have food that's a third of the way cooked through, we know that a non-Jew cooking food for you is aser. Okay, and it's a very important halacha that a non-Jew is not allowed to cook your food. But let's say you had food that's already a third of the way cooked through, and then you now want to cook it more. At that point, it's called "quote unquote" cooked, and therefore, if a non-Jew puts it in the oven, you have some cases where you have what do they call it? There's a word. Yeah, partially. Is that the word? There's like a part. They have they call it. Yeah, whatever it is. Like something which is like partially done. Once it's partially done, a third of the way through, then a non-Jew now putting it in the oven, that's not going to be a problem. Okay, so same principle. Tanya, Chananya Omer Kol Shu K'Michael Ben Drusai Mutter La'ashos L'Gabi Kira. So this is the opinion of Chananya, and we'll see that there are those who argue, but most of the posts can possibly Chananya, and that is anything which is cooked, the food, the measurement of Ben Drusai Mutter La'ashos L'Gabi Kira, allowed to leave it on an oven. The Afal Pishin Grufa Uktuma, even though the oven is not shoveled out of the coals. And it's not banked. Basically, the bottom line is that even though there are coals there, it's on a regular oven. As long as it's cooked a third of the way through, you are fine. We'll see there are dissenting views, but we do paskin, okay, at least according to most poskim, we paskin like Hananya, and this is again halacha lemaisa, very, very important. Again, this comes up for a cholent, right? How long does it take for a cholent to be ready? I don't know. I'm not sure. I remember speaking to someone at one point, like someone from the Ner Yisrael kitchen, Mr. Goldberg. I don't know if the Goldbergs. Anyway, so basically, I think if I remember correctly, it was like 8 hours. Was like the amount of time that like a cholent is ready. So if you could put your cholent up, so this is probably the most pertinent that people don't do. If you don't have your cholent, you don't have your crock pot covered with a blech. Now that means like putting foil throughout the entire thing. Then you have to make sure that your cholent is a third of the way cooked before Shabbos. In other words, you can't put it on an hour before Shabbos. You'd have to put it on, 2+ hours before Shabbos, or else you are basically, it's not cooked k'machal ben drusai. Okay, very, very, very relevant to halacha ma'isa. Unless you have a blech. If you have a blech, then you could. So it's an easy workaround. It's a good idea to have a blech on your cholent pot, anyways, because you might need to take it out. You might need to add hot water, which we'll get into, or you might need to. You might want to have some Friday night and put some back. Bottom line is probably a good idea to make cover your crock pot with the crock pot with foil. But if you don't, you really have to make sure that your cholent is on the fire for a third of the amount of time before Shabbos starts, or else basically you're leaving it on an open fire, and there's a concern that you might go ahead and adjust it. Yeah, very, very pertinent to halacha l'maisa. Okay. Says the Gemara. Gemara quotes the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, "Einos nistapas." You're not allowed to place bread, and we saw two opinions. Again, keep in mind they're ovens. You have like a circular type of like a dome, and they would stick the bread on the wall of the dome. And the Mishnah said, "Einos nistapas." You're not allowed to place bread on the oven, in an oven before Shabbos, unless the surface of the crust is baked through. Rabbi Lezer said that the bottom has to be baked through. So ibailahu. When Rabbi Lezer says the bottom, the question is tachton heich digabe tanor. Do you mean the bottom, the part that's against the oven wall? O dilma tachton heich digabe or? Doesn't mean that the part that's facing the fire has to be crusted over. Okay, so the Gemara says tashma. Here it says explicitly Rabbi Lezer Omer kadesh yikmu paneh hamidubakim betanor. There has to be enough time for the surface that's pasted against the oven to crust. In other words, the Tanakama was saying that the part that's facing the fire has to start crusting, and Rabbi Lezer is saying not only that side that's facing the fire, but also the other side, the side that's facing the oven itself. Again, keep in mind it's again stuck against the wall. Both sides have to start being crusted over before Shabbos begins for bread to be sufficiently baked before Shabbos. Okay, so again, similar type of principle. You're sticking your bread into the oven before Shabbos, right? You forgot your bread was rising. You forgot to stick it in the oven. Happens, right? So what do you have to do? You have to make sure that I believe that's how we paskin that. So basically both sides of the bread have to be like crusted over in order for it to be enough to be leaving it in there before Shabbos begins. If it's less than that, you would not be able to leave it in before Shabbos. You have to go borrow bread from a neighbor, right? In other words, if your bread's not fully baked, you have to make sure that it's starting to crust over on both sides, then you're allowed to leave it in. If it's less than that, you are not allowed to do so, okay? And then the Gemara is now going to analyze the discussion about the Korban Pesach. Again, you have if Pesach falls out on Friday night, so they would stick the kid, like the Korban Pesach, they would start roasting it right before Shabbos, even though it's not fully roasted or even partially roasted. Ask the Gemara, my taima, why are we more lenient with the Korban Pesach? So Gemara says, Mishum b'nei chavrura zrizin hain. So we spoke this out yesterday, because there's members, a group of people, therefore they're going to like encourage each other, they're going to be much more conscientious. We have a group of people, then we remind each other, right? We don't mess up as much if we have a group of people. So that says Gemara, halav hachi lo. But if it's not the case, then we would not be allowed to place this goat or this kid into a fire. V'amar mar, we had a discussion earlier, Gadia, we're talking about a kid, bein shrik, bein lo shrik, shaper dummy. If you remember, we recognize that when it comes to a goat or a kid, there is much more of a concern, right? If you open the oven, what's going to happen? Air is going to come through, it's going to ruin it, right? So we actually paskin that whether the oven's sealed or not, you're allowed to leave it on a fire. We saw the big leniency when it came to kids. So why are we saying, it's only an exception because there's a group of people? We saw earlier that with a kid, we're going to be lenient anyways, because people will not open the oven, because air comes in, it actually ruins it. Says the Gemara, Hasam, when we said that we are more lenient, that you're allowed, that in case of a kid, that whether it's sealed or not, that you're allowed to leave the meat on to roast before Shabbos, there mintach, it's cut up. It's cut up. If it's cut up, then there it's very, very susceptible to any air ruining it. Hacha lo mintzach. Here we're saying, even though it's full, right? The korban pesach is roasted full. You don't chop it into pieces. They would take the whole thing, they put it on a spit, and they would roast the whole thing together as one. There, if it would not be cut up, right? In that case, you would normally not be allowed to leave it on before Shabbos, because you would not be concerned to open the oven, and therefore it's only because you have this big group of people reminding each other that's why you're allowed to do so. With me?
So where's the opening? We've spoken before about whether it's sealed or whether it's not.
Right.
In this case, there is no oven type situation, right? You're roasting the korban pesach, so I don't understand the parallel with drying.
Okay, so in both cases, even in the case of the kid, we're talking about a case where it is being roasted, but it's roasted on like you have, it's a think of like a barbecue grill. In other words, so it's roasted, meaning it's not an open fire. It's being roasted, but there's still a cover. Open it, close it. So Gemara is asking, wait a second. We saw earlier that you are allowed to roast any kid. So why are you telling me it's korban pesach related? It's true anytime.
So it's for the category of meat as
for the
opposed to for the.
For this type of meat, for kid meat, or korban pesach, the Gemara says not. There, it's somewhere where it's cut up, and therefore it's very, very susceptible. And there, we said, you can put it up before Shabbos because no one's going to open the oven in the middle of the process. But when it's full, you'd be much more. It's not so sensitive. The answer is, you're right, and that's why, because when it's full, you're not so sensitive. It's only when it's a big group of people that's when you are going to do so. Okay. Then the Mishnah talked about the fact that that we spoke about the fact that fire, the fire, in the base of English, remember, it's very cold. It could be cold, and basically what they would do is they would have a room where they would warm up. They'd have a big bonfire. They'd warm up, and then go back to do avoda. They were not exactly dressed so warmly, and they were barefoot. And they would have they'd have a room called the fire chamber room where they would have fire. And there we said that even though the bonfire did not really pick up at all, you just started a little bit. We're not concerned. This says the Gemara. Menali mili. Where's this from? Where do we learn this from? Amar Rav Tikuna lo sevaru eish b'chol mosh v'seichem. Okay, Torah tells us you're not allowed to kindle a fire in any place in your homes. Mosh v'seichem means your homes. Says the Gemara. We infer from here b'chol mosh v'seichem yatzamavir. In your home, you're not allowed to make a fire. Aval tamavir b'duras beis hamokad. But you're allowed to make a fire in the base of Mikdash. Okay, Maskal Rav Chisda asked the question, if that's where you're learning this, that you're allowed to light the fire in the base of Mikdash, if so, afil b'Shabbos nami. In other words, the implication of this pasuk is what? B'chol mosh v'seichem. In your home you can't make a fire, but not in your home, meaning in the base of Mikdash, that's the inference. In the base of Mikdash, you would be allowed to light a fire. So Rav Chisda asks on this, according to your limud, that means that you should be able to do it on, forget saying do it on Friday, you do it on Shabbos. So he says, no, there's no permission to light a fire to warm yourself up on Shabbos. Rav Chisda, he says nothing to do with the pasuk. The pasuk is coming to teach me that I'm allowed to burn the fats and the different parts of the korban. But the reason over here that we're allowed to light the fire right before Shabbos to warm up your hands and feet, that's not part of the avoda. Why are you allowed to do that? Kohanim, Zrizin, Hain. Again, for the same reason that since you have a group of Kohanim, they're conscientious, they're going to remind one another and going to make sure that no one stokes the coal, stokes the fire, and therefore it is permitted. Okay? Yeah? Fine. Now let's talk about if you want to make a bonfire in your backyard or in your fire pit. And you have a fire pit? Yes, no. Okay, fine, whatever. Okay, if you want to, then you would. This is what. So we're going to discuss how much of the fire has to catch on. It's a bit of a technical, subtle, small detail type of a debate. But we're going to see, how much the fire has to be lit. So it says uvigvulin kedesha te'echos. Outside of the base of Mikdash, we have to make sure that the fire catches on to most of the wood. Okay, the Gemara is going to discuss what does most mean. My Ruban, what does most mean? Amarav, rov kol echad ve'echad. Most of every, meaning every piece of the firewood has to be on fire. Okay, most of each and every piece of the wood in the fire has to catch on. Okay, most of the fire has to catch on. Shmuel Omer kadesh lo yomru havo eitzim. Shmuel says the stage is that most of that it has to be where you would no longer say, bring me any more firewood. Okay, so you ever make a bonfire? So we had a little bonfire we make outside our house. My wife was like a pioneer in Sternberg, Camp Sternberg, right? Okay, fine. So she's the one who makes the fire. I just sit there. And what's it called? But basically, so it's like there's that first stage where you're still it's not caught on yet. And so what happens at that stage? Frantically, you're like, bring more firewood, right? So that stage is one stage. Shmuel, that stage Shmuel says. Once you pass that stage, you're good to go. Even though it didn't catch on all the small pieces, that stage, what's the definition of that stage? Where the big pieces catch on, then you're good to go. So when it said rove it means the big pieces. Because at that stage, you no longer say, bring more firewood, right? So we let our kids burn all their old textbooks. It's lots of fun. So it's like old textbooks, not their current ones. What are we going to do with them, right? So they're very flammable. But once you no longer have to bring more, then you're good, because that means the big ones have caught on. So Shmuel is much more makel. He says, as long as the big ones have caught on, you're good to go. Rav says, no, each piece of wood, every little piece of wood has to be caught on. Tani Rav Chia Shmuel. We bring Rav Chia taught a brayso to support Shmuel. It has to be that the fire goes on its own. But it's not like you're not have to. It doesn't rise now by other things still helping it. So as long as you have enough there, then now it's going to go on its own, you're good to go. Now the Gemara discusses a single piece of wood. Okay, until now we've been discussing a bonfire. What about a single piece of wood? So Rav says rov avyo. Has to be most of the thickness. So you have one log. Okay, so think of a fireplace. You have one log, let's say. Most of the thickness has to be done before Shabbos. And some say no, not most of the thickness, but the circumference, meaning around on all sides of the log, meaning not just the top, not just the side, the entire circumference. Okay. Rapapa says, let's do both. Since we don't know which one it is, you need the entire circumference has to be surrounded, so you see the whole thing being singed, being on fire, and it has to be most of the way through, and that's how much you need before Shabbos to begin. Again, that person who had that clever candle that burns down to light a fire, which I thought was brilliant, it's asur. Lamaisa, you can't do it. Okay, Tanai. This discussion about within Rav is actually machlokas Tanai. Yeah.
It's difficult to measure this.
Okay, you can look, you can see. You can see. It's not so crazy. You look and you see if you're not sure, you go further. You could tell when it's singed on all sides.
On the sides, right? But on the inside.
Yeah. You could tell where the fire is like jumping out of. Is if it's on the top, but it's lower. Not crazy. Okay, Kittanai. We have a machlokas tanaim, the same thing. That it's no longer able to be used by craftsmen. Okay, which means that it's most of the way through. Then the craftsman can no longer use this wood. Okay, has to go on both sides, meaning the circumference. Even though there's no proof to this, quotes a pasuk in Yecheskel that says and that both ends the fire consumed both ends of the wood, and the inside is now parched. Can it be fit for work? In other words, so he's just quoting a pasuk that says that when both sides, i.e. the circumference, is ruined, the whole thing is ruined. And now we have just another pasuk that there's some discussion about a pasuk that speaks about fire, and that we have some discussion. And the ach was burning before him. It's referring to a scenario where King Yoyakim, Yirmiyahu brought him a scroll which told him about a future destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and of the kingdom, and basically took the scroll and he threw it in a fire. Okay, but the fire was burning something. What was it burning? It says the ach was burning in front of him. What's my ach? What's ach? Amarav achvana. It means willows. Shmuel amar eitzim shenidliku b'achvana. It's referring to sticks of wood that caught fire in brotherhood, meaning a bonfire. Okay, who's amalahu? We bring support for the first one. That ach means willows. Man by achvana. There was a person traveling through a city. He was a peddler, and he said, "Who wants to buy achvana?" And they didn't know what he was. What he's referring to, achvana. Ashtakach arbasa. We saw that he was selling willows. So we see ach or achvana refers to willows. Okay, fine. Amar Avhuna kanim ein tzrichim rov. We have loose reeds. They do not require that fire catches on to most of them. Why? Because loose reeds themselves are very flammable, and we're going to see a bunch of examples of things which are very flammable. Agdan, however, you tie them together, trich and rov, then you do need a majority. Why? If you tie them tightly, then it actually limits the amount that the fire is able to jump from wood to wood. Garinim, if you have date pits, loose date pits, 8 trich and rov doesn't mean a rov. Nastam bitochalos, if it was placed in a basket, trich and rov, then they do require a rov because again, once they're tightly together, it's hard for it to jump from item to item. Masper Chista, Adra be'ipcha mistabra. Chista challenges Rav Huna. He says the opposite actually makes sense. When you have reeds, they might scatter. Agdan lo mibadran. If you put them together, they're not going to scatter. Garina mibadran. If you have loose pits, it might scatter. Nosam etochalos lo mibadran. If you put them in a basket, it won't scatter. And therefore, he's saying the opposite. It's true that there's no air between them, and therefore it might be hard to spread. But since these things are light, it might it's easier for them to scatter, and therefore you should have to wait until most of it's there because maybe it's going to scatter and it's not really going to catch on to fire. It's Barnami. We have a support, sort of a support. We're in Chaf Amabez. Amrav Kahana. Kadim sha'agdam tzrichem rov. He says when you tied reeds together, then it needs to go onto most of them. Lo agdan ein tzrichem rov. You do not tie them together, you don't need rov. Gar'inim tzrichem rov. When it comes to pits, you do need a rov. Nesanam b'chotalos ein tzrichem rov. But if you place them in a basket, you do not need the rov. What's he holding? Rav Kahana is holding that date pits are very light and very loose, and therefore they might scatter. So he basically has like a compromise view. When it comes to reeds, he says they don't have to be tied together. Reeds are kind of heavy, and they're not going to go flying. And therefore, as long as most of them are, even if they're not most of them, since it's very flammable, they're next to each other. As long as you started the fire, it's good to go. When it comes to the date pits, since they could scatter too easily, you have to make sure that most of them are together. Unless they're in a basket, then you're not concerned that they're going to scatter, and that's the ruling of Kahana. Okay, so 3 different opinions. Tana Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef now says Arba Majuros Ein Tzrichin Rov. There are 4 different types of bonfires that do not need a majority to be consumed because of how flammable they are. Shel Zephes, if it's pitch is very flammable. Vishal Gafris, sulfur is also very flammable. The gears we have in front of us is gvina, which is cheese. Not the most normal thing to put in a fire to use this, but it is flammable. But there's another gears which says shava that's referring to wax, which would make a lot more sense. Okay, vishal revav and grease. All those things are very flammable, and therefore, as long as you start the fire in a little bit of it, even if you have a huge vat of grease that you want to use as a fire, okay, but as long as a little bit of it was lit on fire, then you are good to go. You don't have to wait for the majority. Masisantana, afshal kash vishal gavava. Also, straw and stubble. Those things are also very flammable. Babylonian wood does not need a rove. In other words, as long as a little bit of it is caught on, you're good to go. Maskal Yosef, what is Babylonian wood? Ile masilte. If you want to say it's small strips of wood, people used to use that. Hashta psila. That can't be, because we already learned about a wick of an oil lamp, that you have to make sure that most of what goes out of the oil has to be caught on. In other words, he holds the idea of rove by a wick. Still to be by, so for certainly a wick is much more flammable than a strip of wood. And he says by the wick, you have to wait for a majority to be caught onto fire. So certainly by a small strip of wood. El Rav Yosef, what does it mean that Babylonian wood does not need a rove? Socha da arza, referring to branches of cedar trees, which are very common in Bavel. Rabba bar Abba Amar, Zaza, referring to moss, which is also very flammable. One way or another, basically we're learning over here the general principle. If it's something which is not so flammable, you need most of it to catch on to fire. If it's something which is very flammable, just as long as you lit the fire, then you're good to go. Hadnulach Yitzias Shabbos, we did it. 20 blots, very good. Hadulach Yitzias Shabbos, we finished the first chapter, and we're going to begin with the second chapter, which has all the laws of Hadlakos Neros, very, very relevant, and as well as cooking before Shabbos. We'll pick up, God willing, tomorrow. Have a great day.